This is a representative of the Living Legend Library. We're in the home of Colonel Frank Cleckler, 5412 North Stonewall Drive in Oklahoma City. Colonel Cleckler has one of the largest groups of acquaintances of any man in Oklahoma's history, having served many years as executive secretary of the Oklahoma University Alumni Association. He also served by the veterans with whom he consulted during this tenure of office. Colonel Cleckler has retired now, and during his retirement, he takes almost annual trips abroad. He has sailed the 7 seas. These are unique in that he mostly travels by freighter at sea. This recording of Colonel Cleckler's events in life and his experiences will be placed in the Living Legend Library at Oklahoma Christian College at Eastern and Memorial Road for the public to hear, for the newspapers to hear, for the TV and radio to screen. Colonel Cleckler, will you please take over and start a relation of your experiences?
Yes, Raymond, I have had a lot of travel by freighters. You probably remember that I've been retired now nearly 10 years, and every year but one, I've spent from 2 to 5 months aboard freighters traveling all the seas of the world. I find it a very interesting and, I might add, rather inexpensive way to see the world. I'm not alone in this, as there are hundreds of people all over the United States, mostly elderly, retired people like myself, who travel each year on freighters, and they have a club and publish a news bulletin telling of their experiences. There are both advantages and disadvantages of freighter travel for anyone who wants to see the world in this manner. The advantages primarily are, first of all, the cost. I would say that a travel by cargo ship or freighter is at least half the cost of a cruise ship over approximately the same area. Then, too, you have even better quarters in most cases. Freighters, cargo ships, like hotels and restaurants, vary somewhat as to the service you get, the food you get, and the type of accommodations you have. But for the passengers on freighters, you have this one large advantage in that they are not crowded for space. The space used for passengers is some 3 or 4 decks above the cargo areas, and there's plenty of it, and they don't have to crowd you in, because they can only take up to 12 passengers, which means at the maximum of 12 staterooms. But usually they have about 3 or 4 double rooms and maybe 6 singles or vice versa. Anyhow, accommodations for 12. On many of the cruise ships, particularly in the lower bracket prices, they really crowd you in. And on a freighter, you'll have a large stateroom, maybe almost as big as your bedroom at home. And usually the service is quite good. Many of the cargo ships who carry passengers have Chinese stewards.
I interrupt to ask you, Colonel, what is the term cardinal ship?
Well, cargo. It's the same. It's synonymous with freighter. It's just freight. Ships usually refer to what they're carrying as their cargo, and so many of them are referred to as cargo ships. The term's synonymous. Let's see now. I was describing a bit the quarters and started to say something about the service you get. Not all, of course, ships use Chinese, but many do, and the Chinese are very good at preparing food and as well as taking care of your quarters. And I find them most always they're very accommodating and try very hard to please you. And their galleys, which is of course is the ship's kitchen. The Chinese seems to me do a better job of keeping things in order. Their galleys are just as clean as any as your own kitchen at home. Then one of the main advantages of traveling by freighter or cargo ship over the cruise ship is that you usually have much more time in port to see the port city and even the countryside. Most cruise ships spend a day or less in the port. Freighters, anywhere from half a day is the minimum that I have ever experienced, to a week and even more sometimes, depending on cargo requirements. And as well, and the weather, and availability of help, and things like that. For instance, last year we were in Hong Kong 7 full days. Another advantage of freighter travel is in addition to the time you have in port, you use the ship as a hotel. If you have a round trip, which I usually take nowadays, you have to unpack your bags only once and repack them once. If you're traveling in most any other way, by air, for instance, you've got, or by train, or by any other mode of transportation, your own car and so forth, you're checking in and out of hotels all the time, which not only it's a chore to do, to pack your grip every day or so, sometimes twice a day, things like that. On a round trip on a freighter, you unpack your bag when you get aboard, and maybe 60 days or 90 days or even more later, when you get back to the home port, you repack your bag. While it sounds like a small thing, it amounts to quite a lot. It makes life really much easier. Another advantage, in addition to using the ship as a hotel, is the informality. Practically all freighter traveler is informal. On most ships, you will be expected to wear a jacket and a tie for dinner, but if you don't, the captain probably won't say anything about it. But at breakfast and lunch, usually even just a sport shirt or even shorts for breakfast and dinner. Then there's no dressing for the big occasions, even the captain's dinner. People just, the ladies usually wear not evening dress, but fairly dressed up, and the men a jacket and tie, and that's all.
Okay.
There are some disadvantages, of course. One, for some people, they might miss the lack of organized entertainment. But most of us elderly retired people don't go in very much for organized entertainment anyway. You do have to entertain yourself for the most part, although there will be almost every evening a social gathering or so-called happy hour in the main lounge before dinner each night. But all during the day you must entertain yourself. Sometimes, or I should say on most ships, they have some of the more common deck games, even a deck golf on one ship, and these games where you toss a ring over a peg and darts and things like that for people who are interested in that sort of thing, but no really organized entertainment. Another disadvantage to some people who are inclined to be a bit, might say nervous, who can't just sit and entertain themselves for 10 to 20 days, is on the start of a trip, you usually cross the ocean first. You either cross the Pacific or the Atlantic, and that takes from 10 to sometimes as high as 20 days, with nothing to do but entertain yourself and sit and look at the waves. Now, some people can't take that very long, but most people, I find, most freighter travelers do. You do a lot of reading. Sometimes many times, I should say, the various card games, occasionally a bridge game, but no real organized entertainment. Another minor thing is occasionally you may have a fellow shipmate who's a bit of a bore, or maybe you take a dislike to him, and you're going to be together for 60 or 90 or 100 days. That does happen, but I would say it's infrequent, and usually you can work around so that you're not too much concerned about it. Those are the principal, I think, advantages and disadvantages. As to cost, I always figure by the day. And the cheapest trip I've ever had, and that was due to some unusual circumstances, was a little more than $8 a day. But nowadays, it usually comes to $18 or $20 a day per person. Now, that includes all of your expenses except small tips and shore expense. Of course, you can spend any amount on shore, shopping, or taking trips, but the total cost of your maintenance and transportation nowadays would run anywhere from $11 or $12 to $18 or $20 a day per person. I have been on, I'm sure it's nine freighter trips in the nearly 10 years I've been retired, and have covered most of, I guess, all of the oceans of the world and most of the civilized areas. I've never yet been to Russia or to the Balkans, and I hope to get to the Balkans perhaps on my next trip. I've met made many friends on these trips, and now I have shipmate pals in many cities and in small towns all over the country, almost anywhere I go. It's like it used to be here in Oklahoma, as Raymond told you on the start. I know somebody in every town I go to in Oklahoma. Well, now since I've been traveling so much by freighters, I know somebody almost in every city I go to, and I get quite a bit of correspondence. We freighter addicts correspond with each other about the ships and the routes, what we like and what we dislike, and what we recommend that you do, and so forth. I have quite a volume of correspondence of that kind. It just occurred to me that I overlooked one detail that anybody interested in freighter travel should take into consideration. You must keep in mind, as to freighter travel, that the main business of the ship is cargo. The passengers are that's just a little sideline, and the ship is operated almost exclusively for cargo. So your ship will be tied up at a berth down in the dock area, and when you go aboard the first time, the ship will be loading cargo. There will be dust and noise and machines going, and you won't be in a passenger terminal. There'll be no porter there to help you, and if you don't know what to do ahead of time, you're liable to get lost. The thing, of course, to do is to take a taxi to the pier where your ship is tied up, and get the taxi man to wait while you find the ship and go aboard and get the chief steward. Then he will send a sailor, a crewman, down to pick up your bags and take you to your stateroom. Well, when you you'll go up a little narrow gangplank, and here's all this dust and noise and smells, and the deck will be cluttered with debris of all kinds, and you probably will be terribly disappointed and think that you're going to have to live with that for the next 60 or 90 days. It's going to be terrible. Well, it is sort of bad while they're loading, but then by the next day, you usually go aboard the day before she sails. So you've got about 1 day of that disagreeable situation. Then the very first day out at sea, the entire ship is hosed down. They get this tremendous pressured hose and wash all the dust and dirt off into the sea and spray the whole ship. And by the end of the first day, your ship is spick and span, and your spirits have risen again, I'm sure. But that is a thing to consider, because you really will think you're probably going slumming the first day. I might tell you something about some of the trips that I have taken, maybe a few details about the most interesting ones. I first got started on freighter travel because I had a couple of former employees in the Veterans Administration who were stationed at Manila, and one of them invited me to come out and spend some time with them in Manila, and I found a cargo ship going out, and that was my first experience, and I only went one way on that trip by a freighter, because I was able to get a troop ship on what the Army calls space available, back from Yokohama to San Francisco. That was back, I believe, in 1958. Then in 1959, I had one of the most interesting trips of all. Fortunately, I had been interested in doings in Africa, and wanted to see it, and so I took my next trip down the east coast of Africa to Brazzaville in French Equatorial Africa, and then across the Congo River to Leopoldville. Now, all of these cities I will mention on this have new names now since the Belgians have given up the Congo. But this was just 1 year, the last year of the administration of the Congo by Belgium. And there I took a trip in the interior to Stanleyville, which now has a native name now, and to Bukavu, which also has another name now, and Lake Kivu, and a 7-day trip in the eastern Congo with a native driver and a Volkswagen. No paved roads, but fair accommodations along. But the thing of most interest to me was that it was still under Belgium, and it's been in all the news ever since since the Belgians gave up the Congo. Another very interesting freighter trip of some length was to the Persian Gulf area, and then down the east coast of Africa, and around the Cape, and back to port in New Orleans. Africa, to me, is a very, very interesting place. And we hear so much, of course, about the emerging nations and all that. And so that is one of the reasons that I've been, I've been to Africa 3 times and find it most interesting. And Cape Town, for instance, is one of the most beautiful cities in the world. It's probably not as spectacular as Rio, in that the mountains are not quite so high and not so many of them, but it's a beautiful place. Another interesting place where our ship called on that trip was Zanzibar, known as the Spice Island, and it had just gained its independence just the year before when we called at Zanzibar. We also called at Mombasa, which is the main port of Kenya, and had an opportunity to since we were going to be in port 4 or 5 days there, had an opportunity to get up to Nairobi by train. I went up by train and back by plane. Those are the things that you get on freighter travel that you don't get usually on your cruise ships, because you don't have enough time in port. To me, also, interesting thing about freighter travel is the cargo you carry. It just varies, although you usually go out of ports in the United States, of course, with manufactured goods, refrigerators, air conditioners, automobiles, electrical appliances of all kinds. And then you bring back, ordinarily, ore or raw materials of some kind, or bauxite and copper sulfate and various ores, usually raw materials. I have been on a ship that had 2,800 sheep in it that they were taking from Western Australia to Singapore for the butchers. 2,800 sheep aboard, and they really that sounds rather bad, but they didn't cause much trouble because our decks were we were about 5 decks above the open deck on which the sheep are located, and unless occasionally you would get a breeze to bring the barnyard smell to your cabin, but very, very rarely. My 1960 trip was on a Dutch freighter and was a very interesting one through the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean with the calls in 2 ports in Malaysia, then up the Gulf of Thailand to Bangkok. Bangkok, of course, is one of the most interesting cities in the world, I think, and also the Thais, I believe, are our very best friends, certainly our best friends in the Far East. That I was able on that trip to make a side trip to India by Mats, which is Military Air Transport Service, and back to Bangkok, then came home on mats from Bangkok to Manila to Guam, Honolulu, and San Francisco. So that particular trip was only half by freighter and half by air. My next trip in 1961 was also a most interesting one, and it involved about, I think, 3 different freighters down the west coast of South America, starting, of course, from New Orleans and through the canal, down the west coast of South America, making many of the smaller ports one doesn't even hear about. Of course, we know about the port for Chile, Santiago, and I can't even remember the name of the port for Lima. But there were many, a dozen at least, other ports where the ship called for cargo, both discharging and taking on cargo all the way down the coast of South America. However, I left the ship at Santiago and took the train down to the railhead in Chile, and there picked up another freighter called the Villarica, one of the oldest ships I've ever been on, but not one of the worst by any means, and a most interesting trip from the railhead down through the Straits of Magellan to the southernmost port on the continent, called Punta Arenas. The Villarica was built in the year 1900, and the ship was furnished and all in the Victorian manner, and not very comfortable. For instance, on that ship, my stateroom was not like I described a while ago. It was just not much bigger than a closet, and I had a shipmate in this little place, and it wasn't big enough for both of us to dress or undress at the same time. We had to go to bed at different times. And unfortunately, this fellow was a salesman, a drug salesman, who spoke Portuguese, and I knew not a word in Portuguese, and he none in English. So we had a little trouble with communications. However, I was seated at a table with a Chilean family. The mother spoke pretty good English, and the father fair, and a son who was a teenager at the time was learning English. So he sat, his name was, we would call him Mike, sat next to me, and 3 meals a day he just pulled my brains on English. He would ask quite about pronunciation and facts and everything. He was just learning his English. And most of the people aboard this ship going down to Punta Arenas were on their summer vacations. They were mostly families. I left the Villarica at Punta Arenas and got a German ship, another cargo freighter ship, coming back to Chile, which was a very, very nice ship, but they had only 2 staterooms, and both of them were occupied by German nationals who were coming to teach in the Chilean schools. There's quite a German population in Chile, and the West German government, I understand, pays half the salaries of the German teachers that come over to teach in the German schools in Chile. So they didn't have a stateroom for me, but the first officer was quite a pleasant chap who spoke excellent English, and told me that if I wanted to stay in the what they called the hospital, which is really just a little first aid room with with a couple of bunks and a private bath, that if the captain would agree to it, and I was satisfied, why I could stay in the so-called hospital all the way back to Chile. Well, I grabbed it right off, and it proved very satisfactory. But the interesting thing on that ship was that the chief engineer, a German, of course, being a German ship, was on his way back to Chile for the first time since World War II. He had been a younger officer then, of course, at the start of World War II, and was in the South Seas on a German cargo ship, which was captured by the British, and was interned in Chile, and spent most of the war in Chile. This was his first visit back to Chile to visit the friends that he had made there during World War II. The next trip in I didn't go on a freighter in '62. I spent the winter in Mexico instead with friends, and in '63 made one of the most interesting freighter trips I've made on a Norwegian ship, the Christensen Line, from the west coast of our west coast to the South Seas, calling at Papeete in Tahiti, American Samoa, Western Samoa, Fiji Islands, New Caledonia, and Queensland and Australia, and then back over pretty much the same route back to San Francisco, calling at only about half the ports on the way back. That is one of the most popular freighter trips that I know about, and it's difficult to get reservation space. Takes at least a year or more. They're always sold out, at least a year ahead. Another trip I think I mentioned already was on a Dutch ship on the Ned Lloyd Line, involving two ships from New York to the Mediterranean to the Persian Gulf, East, South, and West Africa, which took over 4 months, and a very, very interesting area. In '65, I took the port line from New York direct to New Zealand. The port line is the freighter business of the Cunard, one of the big British shipping companies. We were 21 days going from New York to Auckland, New Zealand, with only one stop, what the ships call bunkering, taking on fuel oil in Cristobal and the canal. The only stop we made in 21 days. There, at one of the times, that many days at sea, some people who might get bored with too much water. The next trip in '66 was on the Knutsen Line, another Norwegian line, which also is a very, very popular line. They have excellent accommodations, excellent food. As a matter of fact, too good and too much. I put on about 10 pounds on that trip. That run is from our west coast to the Philippines, to Singapore, to Malaysia, from Malaysia to Western Australia. The port is Fremantle, which is the port for the only large city in Western Australia, Perth. Then back to Singapore and back again to Malaysia, both Penang and Port Swettenham. From Port Swettenham on to Japan, where we called at 5 ports in Japan, and so had opportunity to see at least the port cities and 1 or 2 smaller inland trips. Then from Japan, the the name of the ship was the Kristenbaki of the Knutsen line. But they come back from the Far East, from Japan to Vancouver in Canada, and there you have to leave the ship. Then this past year, I think was one of the very best, also one of the most popular runs I know, is on the Concordia line, a Norwegian-owned shipping line from New York through the Mediterranean, calling at the Canary Islands en route. And by the way, the Canary Islands is one of the most pleasant places that I know of in the world, both as to climate and crops and soil and beauty and everything, and also prices. It's one of the cheapest places that I know of in the world today. The Concordia line makes the makes 2 stops in the Canary Islands on the way into the Mediterranean, then calls at European ports, Genoa, and I believe we called in Greece on the way back, but mostly the European ports on the way in and the African ports on the way back. Goes to the eastern Mediterranean, to Lebanon, and also to Latakia in Syria. So we were in that area just a few months ahead of the recent trouble. We didn't get to the port of Aqaba, unfortunately, and neither did we call at Israel, in any port in Israel, but we did call at Alexandria in Egypt. And our last port of call was at Seville in Spain, which is a very, very fine city and a very interesting 100-mile trip up the river. Seville is inland just about 100 miles. And the ship goes up this narrow river very slowly, so that you're able to see a lot of the countryside of Spain, both on the way up and on the way back. And Spain, by the way, is one of my, I believe, one of my favorite countries. It's mostly quite modern, and the people are very, very, very friendly. Prices are reasonable, and the countryside is beautiful. That Concordia trip is also is just about as popular as the South Seas trip I mentioned on the Christensen line. You have to get reservations at least a year ahead on the Concordia line, except on all of them. Occasionally, of course, where people make reservations a year and a half ahead, there are always unusual events happen. People get sick or die or something, and there are, of course, cancellations. But if you want to be sure to have space on these very popular ships, you must get it around a year and sometimes more ahead. That I failed to mention as a disadvantage, one of the few disadvantages of freighter travel. Usually, people who are interested in sea travel are concerned about seasickness and the weather. I have, in all my freighter trips, I've only seen one person really seasick. A few will be maybe slightly nauseated or might miss a meal or two, but it's rather unusual to find anybody who gets seasick. The weather, ordinarily, it depends, of course, on the time of year and where you go. Crossing the Atlantic in the wintertime can be quite rough. On the South American trip I mentioned, there was a young, attractive young matron aboard who had flown up to New York and was going back to Chile by ship and had never been on a ship before. And it's usually quite rough off Cape Hatteras, with about the first, second, and third day out of port. It can be quite rough, and the ship will throw you out a bit, and great waves will come clear over the bow and hit up maybe almost as high as the bridge sometime. Well, this young woman got seasick, and not only seasick, but she was scared to death. She was just sure that ship was going to sink when the next wave hit. And that poor lady, for 3 nights during this rough weather, never went to bed. She sat up in the lounge for 3 nights just to be ready to get in the lifeboat. But that is most unusual. Perhaps the only other time that I've experienced real rough weather was some years ago going up the Formosa Strait. There was a big hurricane in the area at the time, and the weather was quite rough. And the ship was thrown about so that you could hardly stay in your bunk. You had to just brace yourself in your bunk, and some people were thrown out. It was also so rough that the stewards found great difficulty getting the food from the galleys into the mess hall. It was so rough they just couldn't carry pots of food in. But they managed all right. And that only lasted a couple of days. The furniture sometimes, any furniture that wasn't tied or screwed down to the floor would slide around. But ordinarily, I've experienced, only those 2 times have I experienced any weather that was really unpleasant. And as I said, very, very few people get seasick. One runs into many amusing incidents along the route. On this Concordia trip last winter, we called it Sardinia, and that's an island, as you know, belonging to Italy, just not far off the Italian coast. And the port town is rather small, but there's a good-sized inland town, perhaps 15 or 20 miles in from the port. We were unable to find transportation or get information about transportation. We were only going to have 1 day there, but we would have plenty of time to go into the city and back. So 3 of my shipmates and I, we just walked into the little port city. Wasn't very far, and looking for a bus to go to the city. I unfortunately can't remember the name of the city. It's one I'd never heard of before, but a big city of some 300,000 or 400,000 people. Well, there was an interesting old church on a hill just in the edge of this town. And the other 2 shipmates wanted to go up and see this church while we were waiting at a sign that showed it was a bus stop. So while they were going up to the church, I didn't want to walk up that hill that far. So I waited to check on the bus. Well, sure enough, while they were gone, a fine new fine-looking bus came by with the name of the city on it, so I knew that we were in the right place. Shortly after this big bus had gone by, an old rattletrap small car, 4 doors, all right, but it wasn't a Volkswagen, but it was something about that size. But it was rather run-down rattletrap-looking thing, and I was standing by this bus sign. So this car stopped and opened the door and started talking to me in Italian. Well, the car had no sign, or it didn't say taxi, or it didn't have any marking of any kind, but it had two passengers and a driver. So they tried to get me to come in. They opened the door, and when they found out I couldn't talk Italian, they made motions for me to come in, and they even got out and bowed and pointed. I was trying to tell them, of course, that I was waiting for my friends. I didn't know any Italian, but finally the word signora occurred to me. One of these shipmates was a lady. So I pointed to the church and said signora, which is similar, of course, to their word for madame. Well, they got it right away that I was waiting for the signora. So about that time, these two shipmates came around the corner. So then these Italians kept motioning us to get in, and we talked it over a little bit. Said, well, we'll try it. So we got in. We didn't know who they were, where they were going, or anything. But we assumed that it was public transportation, something like a taxi. So we got in and started out, and about the time we got out, about a couple of miles out of the port city, we came up behind one of these high two-wheeled farm carts drawn by one horse. And there were 2 feet sticking out up over the edge of the cart. These Italians in there started laughing and talking. So our driver pulled around this cart, 30, 40 yards ahead of it, and stopped, got out, and ran back to the cart. Well, we saw him picking up the reins of the horse, which was dragging along the highway, and put them in the car. And he got in the cart, and he raised the occupant, who was a peasant farmer, I guess, up and put him on the front seat, put the reins in his hands, and then ran back to his car. And of course, these Italians were laughing and talking. All I could understand was vino tinto. So I guess he was a farmer who'd probably gotten a good price for his crop that morning, and bought and drank too much vino tinto and passed out in his car. But they had a big time about it. Well, anyhow, on that trip there was no trouble at all. They just took us into the city and back again in about an hour. But you run into many interesting and amusing things like that on freighter travel.
We thank you very much, Colonel Cleckler, for this most interesting world.